One question I'm often asked is what's the best entry-level or inexpensive SCART switch you can buy? I plan on doing an in-depth technical analysis video of every SCART switch option out there and why each might be better or worse than the other. But for now, I just wanted to do a very quick review and overview of what I think is the best cheap option, the 6-port Otaku switch. The Otaku switches are SCART or RCA switches that range from $45 to $70 after shipping, which is pretty cheap when it comes to SCART equipment. I have the model here that comes without a case and the RCA inputs, and I think that's probably the first thing to start with. While I don't usually like things without a case, this came with some foam and some standoffs, but open pins on the bottom do make me a little nervous. The standoffs are fine. They seem to protect it well enough so it's not going to pop out, but I still leave the foam in there just in case. The fact that there's no protection on the top isn't that big a deal to me because I normally wouldn't just drop things on top of a switch, but some kind of protection, especially for these open pins, would be nice. But one problem that these switches have is that the clear cases that they're offered with look like they could sometimes not be deep enough for the SCART connectors to go all the way through. So that does seem to be a problem for some people's cables, not everybody's. But either way, I would rather see a 3D printed design from the gaming community. Maybe even if we just had a bottom printed out that could mount onto it, even just a basic piece of plexi, I think that would be a better idea than a weird switch with deep inputs that are able to clear both the RCA and the SCART ports. I'd much rather just have something that's basic safety. As for the other features, this just seems to be a basic mechanical switch. Nothing fancy, no auto switching. It's kind of neat that the pins are available right here. I imagine I might be able to use that for something like using a probe for an oscilloscope to pull signals right off the pins here. That'd be kind of make things easier for testing. But one thing that I'm still kind of baffled about is that there's a voltage regulator here. I have never plugged this thing in at all, and it's always just worked fine. I have no idea what that's there for, and when I emailed the company to ask, I genuinely didn't understand their answer, so I'm sure there's some kind of language barrier. But maybe it's there to provide voltage on the SCART line if you don't have any voltage coming through on your input cable, but need it for your PAL TV. That's just a basic guess, but either way, I wouldn't even bother plugging a power adapter into this. I would just use it right as is. One thing to mention is that while the model with RCA jacks on them support dual output, it is not simultaneous dual output. You could only use one or the other. The reason for this is that what you're essentially doing is sending any of the input signals to both of these output ports at the same time. And unless there's specific circuitry on here, you can't split the signal without drawing twice as much from the source device, which could, at the very least, dim the output, but it would more likely cause excessive wear and tear or even damage on your consoles. So it's cool that you have both, but only use one at a time. My suggestion is whatever is the cheapest and easiest setup for you to use. So for some people, it might actually be cheaper to spend the extra money on the version with the RCA jacks and then just use existing high-quality RCA cables, and then maybe even some BNC to RCA adapters like these. That way you could just plug it directly into the back of an RGB monitor using cheap adapters and pretty cheap shielded RCA cables. Otherwise, I would probably just stick to the basic SCART stuff, because if you buy the cheaper model that only supports SCART and you plan on upgrading in the future anyway, you're still going to need a SCART to BNC cable regardless of which switch you use. So maybe it's time to spend the money on the cables now and save the money on this cheaper switch. One advantage of this is that it's just a dumb pass-through switch, which in my opinion is a really good thing. That means you could take component video through RGB, or you could take RGBS signals, RGBS, or even just stick composite video through here, or even RCA optical audio, I guess. And whatever comes in on these ports will be outputted on those ports. Now, for things like RGB and component video, you could mix and match. Once again, you can't have two inputs at the same time. You can't have one on this and one on that. You have to pick and choose for each numbered input if you're going to use RCA or SCART. But it is kind of a neat thing to have maybe a few component consoles and a few RGB consoles, and then whatever your output is, just select it on your monitor. I'll demonstrate this scenario later in case anybody's confused about the explanation, but options are always a good thing, and this passes through whatever you put into it. Now, I did spend some time doing performance tests to see if there was any interference added by the switch, and while I spent a bit of time with it, I certainly don't have the amount of hours that I have in a device like the G-SCART switch. But some of the testing that I did do was populate all of the inputs, and I believe this SCART output could be switched between output or input. So I did try populating all of the SCARTs, outputting RGB through the RCA cables into a capture card. And what I found was that even when all 6 inputs were powered on, nothing seemed to interfere with the other. I mixed and matched RCA and SCART, but once again, never plugging both in on the same input because that's definitely not going to be good for it. But I tried mix and matching, I tried having all the consoles on, and the only thing I couldn't do too many testing on was what happens if you have a bunch of consoles that sync on composite video. One thing I definitely want to mention is that this switch did not produce any interference as a result of using cables that synced on composite video. So one thing to keep in mind is that some of these cheaper SCART switches have such poor routing on the boards that when you take cables that sync on composite video, even really well shielded cables that have zero interference going into a capture card, they'll end up with the same interference because of the way the lines are run on the board itself. Essentially because you're turning it into an unshielded cable. And that is not what I found with this one at all. I put a few composite video sync solutions through it at once. I didn't have 6, but I put as many as I had at the moment, I think 3. And all of them seemed to perform fine with no additional interference whatsoever. I also did my typical link tests in A Link to the Past where I zoom in all the way to his head and didn't really see any difference at all from being plugged directly into the capture card. So as far as basic tests go, this did pass every one of them. As far as any in-depth future testing goes, I'd like to put this on an oscilloscope to see if it has any kind of interference at all that's visible on a scope. Now this isn't going to change voltages or anything. You certainly don't have to worry about sync levels being too high or anything changing. I was really more curious along the lines of, can I see anything zoomed in on a scope that causes interference that you wouldn't see directly in? But as far as my usual video capture tests go, I honestly couldn't see any interference whatsoever. The only other test that I would have liked to have done is to populate every single one of these ports, one at a time of course, but with sync on composite video cables and see if there was any leakage. Who knows, maybe this port would leak over some signal interference, but this one and this one wouldn't. I really didn't have time to get into that, and my basic tests showed that there wasn't any. So my only suggestion, if you buy this switch and you do get some kind of weird interference, try swapping ports and see if that cures it. Overall, I think it's a really great switch for the money, and I think people should just pick whichever is the best solution for them. I think your average user should probably just get the SCART-only version, and then get a really good set of SCART to BNC cables, and just be done with it. I think any user that needs to mix and match component video, or even composite video along with SCART, and then take advantage of the outputs that could allow for all three. You would then just have to switch composite video output manually on the monitor, but at least you would only have to switch one place and not two. Also, if you wanted to save some money on SCART to BNC adapters, you could use the trick I showed before. And just one last thing to remind everybody of is there is no signal conversion going on whatsoever. So when I'm mentioning things like component, composite, RGB SCART, you really just need to understand that whatever you put in, you get out from this on the other side. And I'd like to show a couple demos just to show what I mean. So here's a pretty typical setup. We have a SNES in Super Mario World, just using straight RGB, going directly into the switch, then out through a SCART cable, and then of course we have a SCART to BNC cable coming through at the back here. One advantage of the model with the RCA outputs is that instead of using a SCART output, you could just use high quality shielded RCA cables and then use something like an RCA to BNC adapter that would just plug directly into the BNC inputs, and that goes right in there. As you can see, it makes no difference to the monitor. Essentially, none of these displays care what connector you're using, they only care what the signal is. So just by using RCA versus SCART makes no difference. And just to further prove the point, here's the HD RetroVision cables inputting component video signal through the RCA inputs, going out the SCART adapter into the RGBS inputs of the RGB monitor. At that point, all you would have to do is just go right over to the monitor itself, switch it over to component video, and it works fine. So this thing will pass any signal through any input out to either of the outputs. So the bottom line is that for the money, this thing does exactly what I would hope. I don't have any complaints, and I haven't found any major issues with it yet. So it's cheap enough where I would feel comfortable saying, go ahead and buy it as your entry level until you saved up for a better or more robust option, or keep it as a spare, use it as a second, who knows. Either way, for the cash, you could feel happy buying this thing knowing that it's not going to cause any crazy problems with your consoles or have any dangerous issues with it. Well, that's it for this time. How does everybody feel about these shorter overview reviews? Should I do more of them about products that I like or things that I hope people stay away from? Or should I be sticking to the more in-depth reviews that I normally do? Either way, if you liked what you saw, please subscribe to my channel and consider supporting my Patreon account, because without my amazing Patreon supporters, none of these videos would happen. Also, check out the weekly podcast, keeping everybody in the loop of what's going on in the retro gaming world, and see some of my other reviews as well.